Welcome back to Crimetime Inc.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to Dundee, Scotland.
Okay.
We're going to talk about the unsolved murders of Carole Lannan and Elizabeth McCabe. The thing is, no one has been convicted for Carole's murder. And the main suspect in Elizabeth's case was acquitted.
Wow.
Both women were found in Templeton Woods, less than 100 yards apart.
Oh, my goodness.
So to understand why we need to look closely at each case,
Okay.
Carole was 18
Okay.
and a mother.
Okay.
She was working as a prostitute
Okay.
when she disappeared.
Right.
Elizabeth was 20 years old, and she was training to be a nursery nurse.
Okay.
And everyone said she was really shy and quiet.
Interesting.
Two very different lives.
Yeah.
But both tragically cut short in the same location.
So let's start with Carole Lannan.
Okay.
She was last seen on March 20th, 1979,
Okay.
getting into a red Ford Cortina estate car.
A Ford Cortina.
Yeah. Witnesses thought it was a taxi.
Oh, interesting.
The next day, her body was discovered in Templeton Woods.
And what happened?
Well, she was found stripped naked.
Oh.
Her hands were bound.
Oh, gosh.
And a ligature around her neck showed she had been strangled.
That's awful.
But here's where it gets even stranger.
Okay.
11 days later,
Yeah.
her handbag and some of her clothing were found 80 miles away
80 miles.
on the banks of the River Don in Aberdeenshire.
So was this a genuine discard by the killer or a deliberate attempt to mislead the police?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's one of the many enigmas surrounding Carole's case.
So now let's move on to Elizabeth McCabe.
Okay.
She vanished on February 11th, 1980,
Okay.
after a night out with friends. Her body was found 16 days later on the eve of her 21st birthday in Templeton Woods.
Oh, that's so sad.
I'm...
So, like, Carole Elizabeth had been strangled,
Yeah.
but this time manually, no ligature. But there were distinct differences in how her body was treated.
Like what?
Well, she was found partially clothed, and her face was covered with a jumper.
A jumper.
Yeah.
Like a sweater.
Yeah, and her shoes, gloves, and handbag were all missing.
So it's almost like the killer was trying to protect her identity or maybe felt some remorse.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah.
The act of covering her face does suggest a possible personal connection
Right.
or a different emotional dynamic at play, especially compared to Carole's case.
Adding to the complexity, some of Elizabeth's clothing was found near a bus stop about a mile from her body. And weeks later, her jewelry, shoes, and a photo were found on wasteland near Cobden Street.
Oh.
These discoveries paint a confusing picture.
Yeah.
Was someone deliberately planting evidence to confuse the investigation?
Yeah.
Or was this a way for the perpetrator to relive the crime?
Possibly.
Or even taunt the authorities?
Yeah.
So we're dealing with two young women, both found strangled in the same woods with belongings turning up far from the crime scenes.
Right.
So could they have been murdered by the same person?
Well, that is the question that has haunted investigators for years.
Right.
On the surface, the similarities are striking. Both victims were young women last seen in Dundee city center.
Right.
Both were strangled,
Yeah.
and both had belongings found miles from where their bodies were discovered.
But you mentioned differences earlier.
Yeah.
How do those impact the possibility of a single perpetrator?
Well, the differences are crucial.
Okay.
The way their bodies were treated
Yeah.
suggests different motivations
Yeah.
or relationships between the victim and the perpetrator.
Okay.
Elizabeth's case, with the face covering and scattered belongings, hints at a more complex relationship
Right.
or emotional state of the killer, whereas Carole's case seems more impersonal,
Right.
possibly pointing to a more random encounter.
Okay.
And of course, the methods of strangulation differed.
So are we looking at one killer or two? A copycat, perhaps?
That's certainly possible.
Yeah.
Copycat crimes aren't uncommon, especially when a crime receives a lot of media attention.
That's true.
So let's talk about the investigations. Were there any early missteps by the police that might have hampered their progress?
Well, unfortunately, yes.
What happened?
There were significant blunders in the initial investigations. Manhandling of evidence,
Oh,
potential witness intimidation,
wow.
and even a seance conducted by
A
investigators.
seance.
Yes, a seance.
Are you serious?
But whether it was simply a bizarre anecdote or a symptom of a flawed investigation is debatable.
That's incredible.
Regardless, it raises questions about the thoroughness of the initial investigations.
Yeah, for sure.
So who are the primary suspects in these cases?
Several names came up, but two stand out.
Okay.
First, Vincent Simpson,
Okay.
a taxi driver who admitted to being in Templeton Woods the night Elizabeth disappeared.
His presence in the woods on that night certainly raises suspicion,
Right.
especially considering the witness accounts of Carole getting into a taxi.
And it gets more interesting.
Right.
DNA evidence linked him to the scene, but it was deemed unreliable because of potential contamination.
Oh, wow.
He was acquitted in 2007.
So close, but not enough for a conviction.
Right.
It must have been incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
It was.
So who else was on the investigators' radar?
Another intriguing suspect is Andrew Hunter.
Okay.
He was a social worker,
Okay.
convicted in 1988 for strangling his wife.
He strangled his wife.
Yeah.
That's certainly relevant considering the cause of death in both Carole and Elizabeth's cases.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Adding to the suspicion,
Yeah.
he frequented prostitutes in Dundee and resembled a police photo fit of the man last seen with Carole.
So was he involved in the Templeton Woods murders as well?
Well, that's the question that has plagued investigators for years.
Right.
While there's circumstantial evidence, it wasn't enough to bring charges against him.
Oh, wow.
He was never officially connected to either case.
It's amazing how two seemingly unconnected cases can intersect like this.
It really highlights the complexities of criminal investigations.
Yeah.
Sometimes seemingly unrelated details can hold the key to solving a case.
And sometimes, despite compelling circumstantial evidence, it's just not enough to meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. It's frustrating, but that's the reality of our legal system.
It is.
You mentioned other names that surfaced during the investigations.
Yes. Over the years, theories have emerged linking the murders to other notorious criminals.
Like who?
Like Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper,
Oh, wow.
Angus Sinclair, one of Scotland's most prolific serial killers,
Oh, God.
and even the Zodiac Killer.
Those names certainly send chills down your spine.
They do.
It's almost unbelievable to think that any of them could be connected to these cases.
While these theories were ultimately dismissed mainly due to geographical and logistical inconsistencies,
Yeah.
they add another layer of intrigue to these already complex cases.
It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, investigators must explore every possible avenue.
Precisely.
Right.
And sometimes those seemingly outlandish theories can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, the details of the murders.
Yeah.
The similarities and differences.
Right.
The suspects, the potential missteps in the investigation, and the enduring mystery surrounding these cases.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
And we've only scratched the surface.
I know.
There's so many layers to these cases, so many avenues left to explore.
We'll continue our exploration of these cases in the next part.
So these cases,
Yeah,
they highlight the challenges that investigators face.
definitely. So where do we go from here? What are some potential avenues for further investigation?
Well, revisiting the forensic evidence could be crucial,
Okay.
especially with the advancements in DNA technology.
Yeah.
There might be traces of DNA on the victim's clothing
Yeah.
or belongings that weren't detectable with the methods available back then.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
Technology has come a long way since these murders.
it has.
Even a tiny speck of DNA could potentially identify the killer, or at the very least rule out suspects.
Exactly. And re-examining witness statements.
Okay.
Looking for inconsistencies or previously overlooked details that could also provide new leads.
So do you think there are witnesses out there who haven't come forward?
It's possible.
Someone who knows something but was too afraid to speak up at the time.
Yeah, fear, guilt, loyalty.
Right.
Those are powerful emotions
Yeah.
that can keep people silent for decades.
That's true.
Perhaps someone witnessed something incriminating,
Yeah.
but was afraid of the repercussions to come forward.
Right. Or maybe they were protecting someone.
That's also a possibility.
And those relationships might have changed over time.
Right.
Witnesses might feel less intimidated now, or their sense of loyalty might have shifted.
Absolutely.
Perhaps they're carrying a burden of guilt that's become too heavy to bear.
It's possible time can have a significant impact
Yeah,
on people's willingness to share information.
for sure. And with the passage of time, people's circumstances change.
Right.
A witness who was once vulnerable might now be in a position to speak more freely.
That's true.
Wow.
What about exploring potential connections between Carole and Elizabeth?
Okay.
Do they have any mutual acquaintances?
Okay.
Frequent the same places or anything like that?
Investigating those connections would be crucial.
It would.
Even seemingly insignificant overlaps in their social circles
Yeah,
could be vital in cracking these cases.
definitely. Did they have any friends in common? Did they visit the same pubs or clubs?
I recall reading that Carole had spent time in foster care.
Oh, really?
Could someone from her past be involved?
That's certainly a valid theory.
Yeah,
Sadly, children in the care system are often more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation.
that's true.
It's possible that someone from Carole's past might have been involved in her disappearance and murder.
It's a disturbing thought, but we have to consider all possibilities.
We do.
And speaking of possibilities, we can't forget about the taxi driver, Vincent Simpson. He was acquitted, yes.
Right.
But the DNA evidence, while deemed unreliable, was still significant.
Absolutely. Perhaps there's new technology that you could reanalyze that evidence and provide more conclusive results.
That's a good point.
Or maybe there's more to his alibi than meets the eye.
So could he still be the perpetrator despite the acquittal?
I'm not ruling anything out.
Okay.
It's essential to keep an open mind in these cases.
Right.
Just because someone was acquitted doesn't mean they were innocent.
You're right.
It simply means that the prosecution couldn't prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt at that time.
What about Andrew Hunter?
Yeah.
The social worker who murdered his wife?
Right.
He seems like a very strong suspect, especially given his history of violence and his potential connection to Carole through the foster care system.
He's definitely a person of interest.
Yeah.
The fact that he strangled his wife in a wooded area adds another layer of similarity to the Templeton Woods cases.
Right.
And his frequenting of prostitutes in Dundee aligns with what we know about Carole's life.
It's hard to believe that he was never charged in connection with these murders, given the circumstantial evidence.
Sometimes, despite compelling circumstantial evidence, there's simply not enough to meet the burden of proof required for a conviction. It's frustrating, but that's the reality of our legal system.
I guess so.
We need solid evidence.
Yeah.
Not just suspicion to secure a conviction.
So we have these two prime suspects.
Right.
Vincent Simpson and Andrew Hunter.
Yeah.
Both with intriguing connections to the victims and the circumstances of their deaths.
It's like a tangled web of possibilities.
It is. And untangling that web requires meticulous investigation analysis.
Right.
And a willingness to consider all angles.
It does. We need to look at the forensic evidence, the witness statements, the timelines, and the potential motives of each suspect.
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the psychology of these crimes.
Okay.
What can we learn about the perpetrator or perpetrators based on their actions? What does the way they treated the victims tell us?
Well, while I'm not a forensic psychologist, we can make some inferences based on the evidence.
Okay.
The fact that both victims were strangled suggests a crime of passion or control. Strangulation is a very personal and intimate way to kill someone, often indicating a high level of rage or a need to exert dominance over the victim.
And the differences in how their bodies were treated, especially the covering of Elizabeth's face, could suggest different emotional states of the killer.
It could.
Or perhaps different relationships with each victim.
Absolutely. The act of covering Elizabeth's face could suggest remorse, shame, or a desire to shield her from view. It could also indicate a more personal relationship between the killer and Elizabeth, as opposed to the more impersonal way Carole's body was discarded.
It's a reminder that we're not just dealing with abstract cases, but with the loss of two young women with their own unique stories, personalities, and loved ones left behind.
We're absolutely right. Behind every case file, every piece of evidence, every suspect photo, there's a story of a human life tragically cut short.
So how do we bring those stories to the forefront? How do we ensure that Carole and Elizabeth are remembered as individuals, not just victims in a cold case?
It's about keeping their stories alive. Talking about them, remembering them, and continuing to search for answers.
We need to look beyond the sensationalism and focus on the human element of these crimes.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing here today. We're examining the evidence, discussing the possibilities, and hopefully shedding some light on these dark events.
We've talked about the suspects, the forensic evidence, and the psychology behind these crimes. But there's another aspect we haven't touched on yet.
What's that?
The impact these murders had on the community.
That's an important point.
These crimes weren't just isolated incidents. They had a ripple effect on the entire city of Dundee.
Dundee was considered a relatively safe city at the time. So these murders must have sent shockwaves through the population.
They did. There was a sense of fear. Especially among women that lingered for years.
I bet the disco killer, as the press dubbed him, became a boogeyman figure. Representing the unknown dangers lurking in the shadows.
It's a stark reminder that these crimes, while fascinating to analyze from a distance, have real-world consequences that extend far beyond the victims and their families.
Absolutely. These murders shattered the sense of security in the community.
Yeah.
And that impact can be felt for generations.
So how do we move forward? How do we balance the need for justice with the need to heal and rebuild a sense of safety?
It's a complex process.
Right.
It involves supporting the victims' families, continuing to investigate the crimes, and fostering open dialogue about the impact of these events on the community.
It's about acknowledging the pain and fear.
Yes.
While also refusing to let those emotions paralyze us.
Exactly. We can't let fear dictate our lives.
Right.
But we also can't ignore the very real dangers that exist.
So what can people do to help? How can we as a community contribute to the pursuit of justice and healing?
First and foremost, if anyone has any information,
Right.
no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, they should contact the authorities.
Even a seemingly insignificant detail could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
It could. And secondly, we need to keep talking about these cases.
Yeah.
Keep the memories of Carole and Elizabeth alive.
We need to ensure that they are not forgotten, that their stories continue to be told.
And perhaps through continued discussion and investigation, we can finally bring some closure to these enduring mysteries.
Time really is a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It really is.
It lets people get some distance and maybe see things more clearly.
Yeah.
But also, evidence can disappear.
Right.
Memories fade, and witnesses get harder to find.
Absolutely. But it can also help in investigation.
How so?
Well, like we said earlier, witnesses might be more willing to talk now than they were years ago.
I see.
Maybe they weren't ready then.
Okay.
But now they are.
Right. And relationships change.
Exactly.
Loyalties shift, and people might not be as afraid anymore.
Right. And we can't forget about guilt.
Oh, yeah, true.
It can really weigh on a person.
Yeah, for sure, especially as they get older.
Exactly.
And maybe they just want to clear their conscience.
I think so.
Plus, all the media coverage of these cases could make someone come forward.
Definitely podcasts like ours. Documentaries, even fictionalized accounts of the murders.
I see.
They can all jog memories,
Right.
spark conversations, and generate new leads.
Yeah, keeping these cases in the public eye is really important.
Absolutely. It keeps the pressure on investigators.
For sure.
And reminds everyone that these crimes are still unsolved.
Right.
Plus, it encourages people to come forward with information.
It's almost like we're all working together to solve these cases.
I like that.
Listeners become armchair detectives.
Yeah.
Putting together the clues, discussing theories, and maybe even uncovering important information.
That's the power of true crime.
Yeah.
It makes us think, challenges our views, and sometimes even helps bring justice.
We've explored a lot, the facts, the theories, the psychology and the effects of these murders. But just like any unsolved case, we have questions.
Yeah, that's true.
Will we ever really know what happened to Carole and Elizabeth?
Right.
Will their killer or killers ever be brought to justice?
Those are tough questions.
They are, and those questions might stay with us.
It might.
But even without those answers, we have to keep looking.
Exactly.
Keep the stories alive.
Right.
And honor the victims.
We can't let them be forgotten.
So as we finish up here, let's remember Carole Lannan and Elizabeth McCabe.
Yes. Two young women whose lives were taken too soon.
If anyone out there knows anything, no matter how small,
please contact the authorities.
Your tip could be the one that finally closes this case.
That would be amazing.
It would. I know Tom will have some interesting insights about this case, which he and Simon will discuss tomorrow in their weekly review show. But in the meantime, we'll be back on Monday for another great true crime episode.